in Hebrew in terms of being really funny, but there's a confessional that is recited at Yom Kippur that's an acrostic, and it goes through all of these communal confessions. So he basically did a Zoom confessional, and he found these one-word ways of sort of punning in Hebrew. Like one of them is essentially, I showed up to Zoom in my underwear, kind of, but it all has the sound of the regular confessional.
I want to wait maybe 1 or 2 more minutes before we start, just to make sure everyone gets just a little bit more time. How is the weather in Chicago right now?
Gray and cold.
Yeah.
Tyler, you're still back east, right?
Yes, I'm in Eastern Kentucky.
It's better than where you're at.
I'm sure.
Because you're catching the tail end of that major storm that's going up the East Coast, right? Just the edges of it.
That's right. It's just a bunch of rain and wind.
Yep. See, at least if you were closer to the coast, you'd have the benefit of being able to see some snow. And I mean, even though it's no fun, it's at least fun to look at.
Well, it's coming down, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, not after the fact. But while it's coming down, yes.
Well, it's also fun to look at after it's fallen, before it starts getting all dirty.
Right.
So Rachel.
Yeah.
Remind me, you live in a high rise, right?
I do.
Yes, that has other people out shoveling the snow in front of your building.
It's true. I haven't shoveled snow since I came back to Chicago.
Okay. Yeah. I've been in this house now. This is going to be our second winter, and I am so missing living in our building and being able to just enjoy the snow with no energy connected to it.
Right.
Well, greetings, everyone. My name is Tyler Tully. If you do not already know me, I have the great privilege to welcome you tonight, wishing you a happy holidays as we gather together to celebrate this wonderful book event with Dr. Rachel Mikva. I wanted to go over a couple of very basic Zoom etiquette protocols. If everyone would do me a favor and make sure that you are on mute. If you're having a problem finding mute, just look there on your app or on your screen, and you will see a blue button that says mute. If you're having problems, I can do it for you. We will have time for discussion and questions and answers, hopefully, at the end of our discussion. But for now, it's my great privilege to now introduce our former dean, Dr. Ken Stone.
I had to remember to unmute myself. So good evening, everyone. I'm very happy to be here with all of you. I'm currently professor of Bible culture and hermeneutics at CTS and have been here for a while. And one of my joys as a senior faculty member has been the experience of watching the scholarly projects of faculty colleagues develop over time. And so I'm especially happy this evening to participate in this celebration of Professor Rachel Mikva's new book, Dangerous Religious Ideas, The Deep Roots of Self-Critical Faith in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Dr. Mikva is professor of Jewish studies here at CTS, where she also holds the Rabbi Herman Shaman Chair in Jewish studies. She's also a rabbi, which means, among other things, that she is especially concerned to bring rich academic analyses to bear on the practical decisions that we make as members of religious and political and other communities. And that's one of several things that I think her book sets out to do. I'm going to take just a moment and say that I'm happy to have been the search chair when Professor Mikva was hired. However, at CTS, decisions about faculty hires are made by the full faculty, not the search committee, and then the board. So I have to acknowledge that the wisdom of my faculty and board colleagues was pivotal in our invitation to Professor Mikva to join us. Dr. Mikva has been a transformational member of our faculty ever since her arrival. She's led major initiatives in interreligious engagement. She's led a study course to Israel and Palestine, which I was happy to participate in a few years ago, along with Tyler, who introduced this session. And she teaches 2, at least, of our core required courses in the MDiv MA curriculum. And I remember when Professor Mikva first started teaching a course here at CTS called Dangerous Religious Ideas, and then giving public talks on the same topic. And then over time, I had several conversations with her in which she spoke about the possibility of turning this into a book. And now the book is out. I've got my copy, and it joins a long list of books authored by CTS faculty members. CTS has a very good track record for a small seminary in academic publications, but I do want to note that Dr. Mikva's book just received a positive review in the New York Times, which is not very common for a book in religious or theological studies. So I encourage all of you to search for that. And so we're going to ask Professor Mikva to make some brief introductory comments about her book. Then we'll have a response to her book from one of our PhD students, Rebecca Blackburn, who has been working closely with Dr. Mikva, followed by some further reflections from the author. And then, as Tyler said, we'll open it up for some further conversation. So without further ado, we'll turn the dialogue over to Dr. Mikva.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Stone. That was a very gracious introduction. And I'm very grateful to you and to Dean Crowder and to Tyler Tully and Chad Shikereth and Rebecca Blackburn, Roxy, and all sorts of folks who've contributed to and are coordinating this event. I'm also extraordinarily grateful to all of you, everybody who's here, for making time at such a crazy time in the life of our nation, a crazy time in the semester, a crazy time in the calendar, for making time to celebrate this work. I'm deeply touched by the presence of so many people. Your support and your love, you are my inspiration for so much of the work that I do. So thank you. I just want to introduce what brought me to write the book and a smidgen of its thesis, and then let Rebecca take it from there. Like many on the faculty, I do a lot of teaching and speaking in religious communities. And I kept bumping into 2 assumptions that bugged me. One was that in progressive spaces, people often imagined that they had already reformed their traditions enough so that their religious ideas were never dangerous. And then in more traditional spaces, people often worried that asking critical questions would weaken faith. And I wanted people to re-examine these assumptions, to see the deep roots of self-critical faith that are designed to strengthen and improve religion and deepen our faith, and to recognize that this work is never done, because the minute we assume that all the dangers of religion belong to somebody else's ideas, then we become part of the problem. So I did what professors do when you're grappling with these problems. I started teaching a course. And the questions that the students asked and the discoveries that they made and the challenges that they brought pushed me to want to work on it more deeply, because students always bring out the best in us. So as Dr. Stone mentioned, I started thinking about, does this make a book? It took a long time to figure out how it makes a book, but the argument of the book is that all religious ideas are dangerous. Not only those we might consider extremist, but those we embrace, even those that stand at the heart of faith. And because religious traditions have always understood this peril, they've transmitted these tools of self-critique as an essential dimension of our inheritance. So the seeds for this work are planted deep in the soil of religious thought, and they're designed for us to cultivate. And I believe that if we want religion to be a force for blessing in this world, which it surely has been as well, this is work that we all have to do. So I'm going to stop there and let Becca take it from here, and then offer some more reflections inspired by her response to the book.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. It is so good to be here with you. I am grateful to be sharing this space with you. I want to thank Dr. Stone for inviting me to participate in this event. And I especially want to thank Dr. Mikva, of course. In mid-October, with very little experience working with me, she took a leap and invited me to try my hand at writing a discussion guide for her new book, Dangerous Religious Ideas. And the finished product was, of course, exciting, but even more valuable to me was the process of writing that with her. As I sent Dr. Mikva drafts of the discussion guide, her feedback sent me back to the text for a deeper look, a clearer articulation, a more aligned argument. So from that experience, I can assure you that this book is worth your deep attention. And I'm already looking forward to rereading it, quite honestly, as soon as I have time. This is one of those books I know I will be referencing in conversations and papers for years to come. I've already split it into a lot of Canvas discussion boards over the last few weeks. So I'm excited to talk to you all about it more today. My remarks tonight will come in 3 parts. I will share how the book's central arguments disrupted 2 of my own unexamined assumptions. Then I'll share 3 practices that the book inspires for anyone interested in religion in the public square, which I think a lot of us here have that interest. And I'll conclude with a simple reflection on 2 major themes of self-critical faith. And I'm going to exhale now because I usually forget to do that when I speak in front of people. So why don't you all breathe with me, take a deep inhale and let it out. Thanks for joining me, friends. So as someone who has wrestled deeply with the footprint of her own Christian tradition on the world, one unexamined assumption I held before this book was this: religions are beautiful, but they are frequently and tragically co-opted for destructive purposes. I didn't realize the problems with this assumption, that it leads to an emphasis on restoring religion to some kind of previous ideal, and that it leads to protecting religion from dangerous people. I never clearly questioned who got to define what that previous ideal was and who got to define who was dangerous. This book disrupted my problematic assumptions by asserting that religion had a built-in capacity for harm. Rather than seeing religion as a good thing, often corrupted, Dr. Mikva contends that all religious ideas are inherently dangerous, including ideas like God, salvation, scripture, and chosenness. So we can't start with an assumption that our expression of religious ideas are naturally constructive. Instead, we start with a clear-headed understanding that religious ideas are fire. If we can warm the world, but if we take their power and danger for granted, there can be grave consequences. I hadn't realized myself how these 3 religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, were equipped to carefully tend the dangerous fires within their own traditions. Offering a survey of examples from each tradition, which is well worth the read. Dr. Mikva, self-critical faith that have been transmitted throughout history. I saw my own tradition with fresh eyes, and I learned things about other traditions that I found inspiring. Many of these examples represent self-critical tools, such as cultivating epistemological humility, making room for doubt, embracing multivocality, and acknowledging the evolving nature of interpretation. So by disrupting 2 of my own unexamined assumptions, this book oriented me to the work of cultivating religion. Like a wise gardener, we can carefully tend the soil of religion. We cultivate the seeds of self-critical faith that have been planted before us, and we seek a harvest large enough to bless the world. So how do we as individuals and communities begin to engage this work? There's many, and I know you'll read the book if you haven't already. So tonight I'll just offer 3 broad directions of focus. Number 1, we consider what it actually means to cultivate seeds of self-critical faith. 2 practical places to start are interdisciplinary conversations and interfaith engagement. Incidentally, the book itself is an exemplar of interdisciplinary studies and interfaith engagement. It shows us that rigorous engagement with new perspectives is a crucial step to cultivating self-critical capacities. And one of my favorite passages, Dr. Mikva makes it clear, just as she was saying before me, that the inheritance of self-critical faith challenges all of us, religious leaders, skeptics, and adherents on all points of the progressive traditional spectrum. She notes that mature religious engagement involves facing and owning religion's shadow side. Because religion is indelibly intertwined with public life in America, it is for our collective good that we all learn to handle tools of self-critical faith. This leads us to our second practice, practicing the art of giving public critique without giving in to public contempt. This is a hard one. Dr. Mikva reminds us that asking hard questions is not equivalent to belittling. Hard questions are necessary. But drawing on Kathleen Cavaney and Diana Eck, Dr. Mikva also paints a picture of how our public discourse can embody disagreement while avoiding contempt. This is where we intercept the third practice. We practice the art of receiving critique, perhaps the hardest one of all, and allowing it to make the religious project better. Dr. Mikva encourages her students, and through this book, we all get to be her students, to not run away from strong critiques of religion. Rather, she invites them to engage the strongest arguments and allow it to improve the religious project. This too is a tool for self-critical faith. So 2 of the most important themes that arise from this book for me are the themes of humility and curiosity. These themes invite engagement with religion and its witness in the public square. Rather than a strict separation of religion and politics, Dr. Mikva advocates a conversation model in which religious ideas are critically engaged in public discourse. Drawing on Robert Audi's approach, she argues that when people want to bring their religious commitments into conversation about public morality or policy, they have an obligation to balance what their religion teaches with a broader understanding of the public good. This effort teaches us to stand outside our tradition and see its impact from the perspective of people who believe differently. So in closing, as we seek to make sense of religious traditions and their inextricable relationship with contemporary public life, humility invites us to ask questions. Curiosity invites us to listen and learn. Many of us have probably heard Dr. Mikva say at one point or another that as we grow in our expertise, we actually become more aware of everything we don't know. Our not knowing reminds us how deeply we need one another and the dialectical tensions that come from our various expressions of faith. We need to keep learning, keep examining, and keep improving. So as people seeking to bring blessing into the world, we will do well to begin with humility, with curiosity, and a willingness to self-critique. Thank you. And now we'll hear more from Dr. Mikva.
Thank you, Becca. Those reflections were demonstrated your usual insight and clarity. And thank you so much for saying yes, both to the discussion guide, which is wonderful, and I've gotten such great feedback about it, and to Dr. Stone's invitation to share some thoughts tonight. It's always more fun to think and talk about a book in conversation, sort of. Those of you who've studied with me won't be surprised that I spend a whole chapter nerding out about what I mean by dangerous religious ideas. So religious actually gets the most nerdiness, but I want to speak for a moment just about dangerous, because the dangers of religion include things like justified violence, which might be what first occurs to our minds, but also emotional and psychological and social harm. And many of us here have suffered from these manifestations or elements of religion. Sometimes it jumps out of the book or the pulpit or the street, or even more tragically, perhaps the home. And sometimes it lingers discreetly in symbols and music and metaphors, rituals, the way we envision the future. But it doesn't just happen to us. So as Becca mentioned, I like to problematize every religious idea. And I start with God. And I'm not talking about folks who murder people for having the wrong God. Let's take instead an example of the fact that more than 40% of Americans assert that you have to believe in God in order to be an ethical person. So if we don't trust each other based on what we believe about the divine, that's dangerous. In our polarized society, we don't trust each other about much. But the fact that God is another one of those factors is dangerous. And to this day, atheists face daily assaults on their beliefs and find it difficult to get elected to public office in the United States. We have theists in opposing camps, and we're sometimes among them, some of us, on reproductive rights and gun safety and tax policy and a host of other divisive issues. And we frequently presume God's on our side, right? And that sometimes leads to heaping moral condemnation on our adversaries, in which case God becomes a kind of an idol who is carved in our own image. The way I described it in the book is as a yes man, pardon the gender politics there, but a yes man who endorses our politics and prejudices. But let me try to hit a little closer to home for this community, because it's hard to get progressives to really think about our own ideas as dangerous. And I would mention one thing is that rejecting a religious claim is also a religious claim, right? So I'll lift up my own sins here, if you will. My commitment to pluralism leads me to easily denigrate or dismiss those who are absolutely certain that they have an exclusive and supreme grasp on God's own truth. But I have an evangelical Christian colleague who said to me, and I thought this has stuck with me because I think it's really important. She said, we can't always be the problem that needs to be solved rather than the person with whom you build relationship. And I think that's really compelling. Or another example, since danger and injustice aren't universally perceived, let's talk for a minute about gender issues. Traditional communities within the Abrahamic, and notice the gender there, right, the Abrahamic phase. I like to call them the traditions of Abraham, Sarah, and Hajar, but it's a little wordy. Anyway, they have particular practices related to women that progressive groups frequently consider oppressive, right? Limitations on leadership, inequality in legal status, stricter requirements for modesty in clothing, restrictions on reproductive rights, and other religiously endorsed positions are experienced as dangerous. And we may feel that religious authority is suppressing the freedom of women and will denounce it as a perpetuation of patriarchy. And I think that's an important stance. At the same time, we have to recognize that many women within traditional communities affirm the value of these practices and the ideas that underlie them. And we can argue that this is internalized oppression, but not without denying these women's agency to some extent. So we have to complicate our assumptions here. When I directed JCIS, we once ran a program called Women in Traditional Religion, where they came and spoke about, it was a Catholic nun and a community leader in Islam, a hijabi, but not particularly traditional. She was a stand-in for somebody who was more traditional. And an Orthodox Jewish woman who was one of the first ordinees of this Orthodox seminary that would ordain women. Because our community just assumes they were all oppressed and they needed to come and talk about a different vision of what it means to be a woman in traditional religion. Anyway, another aspect in terms of the way we think about internalized oppression is that the gender critique we offer often inadvertently adopts tropes that are shaped by the legacy of colonialism. And even women who are seeking to reform aspects of their religion, who do feel that certain things are unjust or not ideal, often perceive that the greater danger lies in society's politicization of their bodies, which we as progressive voices are helping to do in some ways, and the marginalization of their tradition. So I think we have to recognize that our positions, while they are important and we need to find the discourses in which to constructively talk about them, also have dangers. And we carry a lot of residue of things we think we're cleansed of too. Rabbi Nancy Fuchs Kramer acknowledges this in her thinking about chosenness, and I mentioned that in the book. Became evident to her when she would speak with progressive Christians who would decry anti-Jewish tropes in Christian teaching and then still use them in ways that were more subtle and which they weren't aware. And then she realized she did the same thing in terms of certain aspects of thinking about chauvinistic aspects of thinking about chosenness. So I've experienced students at CTS who are surprised when they realize how much of the New Testament's anti-Pharisaic polemic they've absorbed and how it's reshaped their understanding of Judaism. And so even though they know better, they catch themselves denigrating the law as contrary to the spirit, suggesting that ancient Judaism was too parochial. So the way I say it in the book is Paul invented universalism the way Al Gore invented the internet. So the book spends some time trying to make sure that we're not assuming this is only about somebody else, right? That this is also about us. And of course, I acknowledge the great good that religion has stimulated as well. As Becca mentioned, I compare it to fire. Something that it's in its variety of forms is responsible for great blessing. And we can't imagine our world without, but it's also capable of ferocious destruction. And it's not always the action of a sociopath, right? Often it's accidental. Sometimes we think it's justified or necessary. In the book, I consider some examples of this double-edged sword. So those of you who haven't read it, I'll just kind of lay out the outlines of the bulk in the middle, right? So I start with scripture. Is it a sacred call to advance justice and mercy amidst God's creation, or a selectively read authorization to vindicate our own worldview and to marginalize those who disagree? Is chosenness or election an aspirational covenant to become worthy of God's blessing and an extension of it? Is it about faith in God's abiding love and grace, or is it to justify a claim of exclusivity and superiority? Reward and punishment, does it help to enact some measure of justice to discern meaning in suffering? Or does it encourage retribution and lead us to blame victims for their plight? And, you know, the answer is yes. It's meant all these ideas have meant all these things, and their meanings have had consequences, real consequences. So in addition to recognizing that the dangers are not found only in someone else's religion, I argue that self-critical faith requires that we recognize how the power to heal is bound up with the power to harm. We're never going to be able to sort of permanently and completely shed the dangerous skin, right? And this was what Becca was talking about, that to have some purified central essence of religion. Well, this is now, you know, what we have. This is true religion, and that other stuff, that wasn't really religion. That's never going to happen. This is an ongoing exercise of self-critical faith. So the power to heal is bound up with the power to harm. And I'll stick with scripture as an example. So as I said, I do think it can be a call to advance God's justice and mercy amidst creation. And it has abiding relevance. I mean, this is astounding that a text, you know, millennia old can still speak to us. But as long as there's scripture, people will wield the word against one another to justify their own worldview, because it's really tempting to say, not only do we think you're wrong, God says you're wrong, even if we don't think that this is a verbatim dictation from the divine, right? We still think God whispers through its pages and tend to use it as a club sometimes. And we'll need to reckon with the voices that were left out of the canon, and those that are demeaned by the canon, right? An eternally relevant text automatically canonizes othering. This is a lot of what we're dealing with in terms of religious oppression today. And attitudes that were grounded in a particular historical context become eternalized. So it can't be a force for good without having the power to harm as well. And even if you try to edit it and take out all the rough spots, it has this claim of ultimacy and of abiding relevance, and the power to speak across time and space, the call to discern what God asks of us. That's all central to what we need religion to be, but also central to the harm it can cause. I think that the new atheists lift up an interesting aspect of this tension. David Hollinger, basically the problem that my students have with the new atheists, and I'm going to make them read one again next semester when I teach this course, is that they lump us all together. They think that we're an equally dangerous part of the whole religious disease that afflicts the world. And so David Hollinger phrases this in a beautiful way. He says, can't they tell Methodists from morons? But in fact, what the new atheists are saying is this is part of a multi-headed hydra, right, that is spitting venom into the body politic. And if we are part of that hydra, even if we're not the venom spitting part, we are helping to sustain this animal, right? This nature. Now, I don't believe that religion is separable from human existence, but and this isn't responding to another idea that Becca lifted up. I really think we have to get better at debating religious ideas in the public square, not as our unique claim to truth. We did that for centuries. That didn't work out so well, but rather as a concern for how they impact the common good. To discover together our truths to live by, to take our moral confidence and prevent it from hardening into moral certainty. So to be willing to fight for what we believe, but also to be willing to bring that into the public square in constructive ways. Looking at the time, I'll just say a couple more things and then we'll stop for questions and comments. By the way, if you've already thought of questions, you can start typing them into the chat so you don't forget them. To complicate matters further, I think it's also important to recognize, and I do this a little bit in the book, that some dangers are desirable, right? This is part of what is alluring about religion. Roman orators and poets condemned the Sabbath as a pernicious idea. They were convinced that it undermined the ethos of productivity that was at the heart of Roman achievement. Rutilius Nematianus called it a plague of ignoble sloth. Seneca argued that it forces people to waste a seventh of their lives. And so today, amidst another culture, ours, that tends to value people based on their achievements and productivity rather than their basic humanity, we, I hope, would recognize substantial merit in this dangerous religious idea to challenge that materialistic standard. And since the Sabbath promises rest for servants as well as masters, it's likely that the egalitarian commitment also had something to do with early Roman suspicions about the Sabbath. And in this regard, we would certainly celebrate religion's subversive power. We no longer consider the Sabbath a dangerous religious idea, but the polemicists weren't wrong in thinking that some of the most important teachings in Hebrew Bible and other religions, they actually can destabilize society. They help us to see a world that's different, that could be different than it is. So Hebrew Bible is the one I know best. So thinking there, God's commitment to free a people from slavery, that's pretty disruptive. The redistribution of wealth every 50 years in the Jubilee to ensure that there won't be a permanent underclass. That's a phenomenally brilliant, dangerous idea. So dangers come in all shapes and sizes, and some we would embrace. And again, the capacity within religious thought to imagine a world that's different than the one we live in is an important and vital source of its power. And these complexities, I think, are part of what make it all the more important to recognize and activate what Becca talked about, the self-critical capacities in our traditions. And a lot of the book examines how this was done, and then I bring those conversations into the public square to think about how we could do it. But in general, I want people to understand that self-critical faith is not some tool of secularism bent on destroying religion, but rather built into our spiritual inheritance. Or to poke progressive assumptions perhaps a little more effectively, it's not a modern invention that might rescue us from religious extremism, and it's not the exclusive property of us liberal religionists, but rather it's the foundation for deepening faith and the glue for holding together our diverse society. So let me stop there and ask Tyler if you would help.
Well, first, let's give Dr. Mikva a round of applause, virtually or otherwise.
Thank you.
In an age of bumper sticker rhetoric, what a blessing it is to have thoughtful and nuanced scholarship around such difficult material that is seemingly tearing some sectors of our world apart while uniting others. If you find value in this type of scholarship and education, including the intergenerational dimension here, where we have PhD students, senior scholars, and junior academics coming together as a community, I would encourage you to be a part of our Chicago Theological Seminary Giving Circle. I'm putting a link right there in the comment sections. Please continue to help us invest in the future of theological education. Now, as Dr. Mikva mentioned, we have the great pleasure of extending that conversation here and now. There are a couple of ways to be a part of the conversation. The easiest way is to, as she already mentioned, type your question in the chat section here on the right-hand corner of our box. If that's uncomfortable or unavailable to you, of course, we can also just verbalize the conversation as well. If you have something to say, you can notify me as the host by clicking the little hand next to your name there on the sidebar. If that's too complicated, please simply unmute yourself, holler at me. I won't be offended, I promise. We want to welcome everyone into this conversation, and let's begin with a question from Marshall. Marshall wants to talk about agency. The way that you talk about dangerous religious ideas, there seems to be benefits and drawbacks to the type of dangers that those bring, Dr. Mikva. What role does agency play in that for those people who might see themselves as opting into some of these dangerous religious ideas?
So it's interesting. I was going to think about agency a little differently based on when I had lifted up the word agency. So I hope to answer the question, Marshall, and if not, you can jump back in. I think that one of the powerful, let me start here. I don't think religious ideas are more dangerous than any other kinds of ideas, right? I think that secularism has also demonstrated its power to do the same things as has nationalism. But excuse me. But there are a couple aspects related to religious ideas that I think are significant in the way that our work happens. And I think I can link this to agency. So one is ultimacy, right? The idea that we have the capacity, religious ideas have the capacity to override other criteria for justice or for goodness, or to deny evidence, right, of countervailing ideas. And when you when you spoke about people who buy into dangerous religious ideas, I think this danger of ultimacy is inherent in that. They may have other capacities that could lead them elsewhere, but religion, I try not to use this word, but it's a trump card, right? So the second aspect that makes religion, gives it its unique power, is that it's woven through every aspect of our psyche and society, which magnifies our power and its power and presence. And that's where I go nerding out about religion. I talk about how it's woven into our will for pleasure and power and meaning, all kinds of psychological needs, how it's a building block of human community. That's our sociological needs, right? The custodians of our cultural values, like with the whole field of anthropology. It's an element in our biological and neurological experience in human evolution. So it's so deeply woven through us. It, I think, raises really important questions of agency. And at the same time, also gives it its uniquely omnipresent power, right? It's somehow part of everything. The third thing I think is unique about religion, it doesn't relate as much to agency, is that in the public square, I think religious ideas are generally given a pass, and that's a unique aspect of their dangers, as opposed to other kinds of dangers that might enter the public square. So even though it's not my field, I found myself really intrigued by some of the biological evolutionary scientists who are working on how they think about religion. And they begin to talk about we are self-conscious agents of our own evolution. Right? Some of it is biological, but some of it is framed by the choices that we make. And I think, therefore, agency is a central question. And I don't know exactly which aspect of it you were hoping I would address further, but that's sort of the way that I think about the central importance of agency.
Well, a related question has to do with your own tradition, Dr. Mikva. You mentioned in the book that there are long-standing debates within seemingly essentialized religions like Judaism, right? Where looking backwards, we like to put them all in one shoebox and say, everyone believed this throughout time, and that's just the end of the conversation. But you tease out those misconceptions by saying that some traditions actually lean into those gaps that are produced between disagreements when people exercise their agencies. Could you speak a little bit more about that and how that comes to play on this larger thematic?
Sure. I mean, Judaism did, in fact, in the rabbinic period, valorize multivocality. It's present in the Hebrew Bible. They found it in the Hebrew Bible. But over the process of living as an oppressed minority, more or less oppressed minority, they were way more afraid of division than of difference. So they ended up really valorizing the idea that there'd be multiple perspectives and recording majority minority opinions and doing all kinds of things. Because 95% of world Jewry today is shaped by rabbinic Judaism, it's kind of embedded in that culture and in that attitude. That doesn't mean there weren't serious debates about certain ideas, but there's, it's always problematized what does Judaism say about X? You'd get, the jokes, two Jews, three opinions, right? Those kinds of things. But what I discover and share in the book is that really the religions I know anything about, even if they didn't valorize it to the same extent, multivocality was an inherently important part of their traditions too. So think about the gospel according to, right? In the canon of the New Testament, we're saying it matters that there were different perspectives on this sacred story, and we need to share them. And let's argue for centuries, of course, about which ones go in. And we won't all agree, and some sects will continue to transmit other ones, right? but the gospel according to, and we have 4 different versions. Similarly, in Islam, the sacred text of Quran itself, there's a tradition that Muhammad, the Prophet Muhammad, received 7 harf, 7 versions of it. He could recite 7 different versions of Quran, each appropriate in teaching. Right? They were aware of some differences and canonized, really, this idea that scripture could speak a little bit differently to different people without changing its meaning, right? And that this was just highlighted the miraculous nature of Quran, but also lifted up multivocality in a particular way. So one of the things I say in the book is that really no religious idea has always meant what we assume it means, right? That there is a longer and more complicated history to every religious idea, even in the shorter term. So thinking now in the public square and evangelical leading the charge against reproductive justice, when Roe v. Wade passed, the evangelical Christian community was in support of it. Right? Nobody knows that now, and we have a really short memory. And I think that we need our history. Dr. So said this to me the other day. He was thoughtfully talking about the important role of history in mature religion, right? You can't, if you don't know that things used to mean something different, or that this was a long-standing argument, you assume that your way has always been the way. And so for the epistemological humility that Becca was lifting up, I think we need to recover our histories.
So getting down to brass tacks, we've had several questions about, so we live in a pluralized world. How do we make these decisions? What criteria do we go by when we demarcate what makes a dangerous idea from a safe one, or a good one for a bad one?
Well, I think Becca said it best. I think we need each other. I mean, I think we have assumptions. We bring those into the public square. We argue our case. And as she mentioned, I grew up in the tradition of John Rawls that said basically, you can have religious convictions, but basically you need to argue your ideas in the public square in secular terms, based on arguments to which we would all have equal access, right? Public reason. So for a lot of my life, progressives seem to cede the public religious voice, and it wasn't for lack of religious conviction, but this liberal commitment to pluralism and to the Rawlsian public religion. And the problem with that is it gave the erroneous impression that political liberalism is hostile to religion, that religious voices are somehow being pushed out of the public debate, and that religious means conservative. Right? So, here at CTS, we're obviously all about reclaiming a progressive religious voice in the public square. And I believe that Robert Audi is onto something when he talks about needing to stand both inside and outside our traditions to know what we believe, but also to see its impact as perceived by others in order to figure out how it may or may not be a platform for the common good, right? And I don't think we can do that work alone. I don't think we have to, hold our convictions inside. I think we need to do this work together, bring our convictions to it, but have this dual posture where we can stand both inside our tradition and also be accountable to others in our space. And I talk in religious engagement, I talk a lot about how can we be accountable to one another. And we know this from all kinds of alliances, that's a challenge, right? That we think we're in this work together, but how are we actually accountable to one another?
So we live in a world where the public square demands oversimplification, and it demands us to push these binary alternatives. And we've had several questions related to that public sphere. How do we cultivate these conversations that disturb that very simple binary, while also leaning towards love rather than contempt? You know, that critique of the thing that we love ostensibly versus just the contempt that we have for the mess that we've made.
I think, I think that's the goal, and I recognize that it's hard. It's hard both, as Becca pointed out, on the dishing end to do it well, and on the receiving end. The rabbis actually have a whole lot to say about the ethic of criticism, right? The ethic of reproof. And based on their standards, I don't think I've ever done it very well. But I do think, as you suggest, that, the word critique, and I'm going to nerd out again, coming from ancient Greek, is about, it's different than criticism, right? It's about the repair of the polis, right? It's supposed to be by design a tikkun, a repair. That was Hebrew mixed with Greek, right? So a repair, a way of thinking about what should or could be different in order to repair the polis that isn't functioning exactly as it should. So I think that that's part of it. I also think there are particular tools that are helpful. In the book, I just talk about, I mentioned, actually Becca mentioned, or Kathleen Kavanagh, who teases out this difference between condemn and contemn, right? But it's just one little letter, but it's huge, right? We can feel very passionately that this is dangerous without heaping contempt on the people who are teaching it. And I think this is something that we've lost in every sphere of discourse in the public sphere in this current era. I don't think this is the only era of polarization, but I do believe that it has grown acute and that we've lost that capacity. Diana Eck, I cite in the book, she talks about using our voices differently, right? So she's responding to a Baptist pamphlet, Southern Baptist pamphlet, talks about Hindus lost in total darkness. She uses her voice as a scholar of Hindu traditions and her voice as an American who defends them being able to say whatever they believe, even if it's hurtful, and her voice as a Christian, where she sees the Christian Testament very differently than they do. But she wields all three of those voices in ways that do not denigrate the Southern Baptist, but challenge the pamphlet and its teachings. And I thought that's a useful model. I also think that in contexts where we have relationship or where we can build relationship, that some of the standard tools of conflict transformation can also be useful, where we move from position-based argument to interest-based argument, right? So can we, in fact, excavate, right? They draw it usually as icebergs, right? And you got the two little guys tugging the rope at the top of the icebergs, and then you draw the icebergs, and in fact, they overlap. So if you can excavate the interests and the needs that are driving the positions, can you find some overlap? The example that I give in the public square is around abortion. And it's complicated because, this kind of work also involves compromising things that are very important and even central to the position. But if in fact, one of the, you can't affirm both positions, but you can find a course of action that might fulfill or meet some of the needs and interests of the competing positions. So one of the examples I give is the scholarship is a little early, a little young, but interestingly, it appears that there are fewer abortions under Democratic leadership because we do better at contraceptive education and sex education and other things. So if in fact, if part of reproductive justice from the anti-abortion camp is to is to have the fewer abortions, well, then perhaps some of the strategies of the reproductive justice advocates can advance their needs as well. So I think that there are tools like that that we can utilize as well.
I think this is a wonderful opportunity to bring everything to a conclusion tonight. Thank you again for joining us this evening as we've celebrated several different scholarly accomplishments, but all organized around our dear teacher and rabbi and doctor, Rachel Mikva, in this wonderful new book. I hope that you get a copy and that we continue this conversation in our homes, over the holidays, in our places of worship, and wherever we are together. Thank you again for taking the time to be here. Dr. Mikva, you have made such an impact on my life and scholarship, and so many others here I know are grateful for who you are and every gift that you have continued to bring to us. May you continue to be a blessing for our community, and may we be a blessing back to you. Thank you for joining us this evening, and I hope you all have a safe and pleasant evening. Good night.
Thank you.
Good night. Thank you.